Okay, good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to this, the second of our Dante lectures. And I'm delighted to welcome tonight's guest all the way from the United States, Paola Nasti. Paola is an associate professor of Italian at Northwestern University in the United States, and her research focuses on medieval Italian literature and religious culture, textual and intellectual history. She studied at the University of Naples and the University of Reading, and she trained as a Dante scholar and medievalist there in Reading, where she obtained her PhD. Her doctoral research and her first book explored Dante's appropriation of the biblical books attributed to King Solomon. And there she considered how the medieval Bible, transformed and enriched by centuries of commentary and devotional readings, was capable of providing narrative and rhetorical models, as well as wisdom for Dante himself. So, and the title of that book, which is published by Ravenna, by Longo Editore in Ravenna, was Favole d'amore e saver profondo, la tradizione salomonica in Dante. And the study of biblical intertextuality in Dante's works has remained her main academic passion, and continues to offer the vantage point from where she views how manuscripts, texts, narratives, and ideas spread among the communities of readers to which Dante and other medieval writers belonged. The reception of texts and modes of interpretation is at the heart of her work on the early commentary tradition of Dante. And here I think I should also recall her co-edited volume with Claudia Rossignoli, interpreting Dante essays on the traditions of Dante commentary, which was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2013. Paola also wins the prize for the best title of lecture for our series this year, and it really is a beautiful one. It is Farfalla, Angelica, Aristotelian refashioning of biblical insects in the Comedia. Paola, a te la parola.
Grazie, Dara. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you tonight, even if just on Zoom. It would have been lovely to be in Cork, a place I visited, when I was very young, like many Italians, trying to discover the beauties of Ireland. So thank you very much for inviting me, even if just on Zoom. I hope that today's talk will be of interest. I'll share with you a PowerPoint, as it has become quite normal on Zoom. I will not read necessarily all the citations, but they are there for you, especially given that this talk is recorded, they might be a good point of reference. So I'm sharing my screen with all of you, and thank you for being here tonight. I've changed slightly the title, Angelica Farfalla, the Aristotelian refashioning of a biblical insect, and as we will see, we'll focus specifically on just one insect. Right, okay, so thinking of the form in which the immortal soul will be reunited to God in heaven, Dante imagined it in the shape of a butterfly. O superbi cristiani, miseri lassi, che della vista della mente infermi fidanza avete nei retrosi passi. Non v'accorgete voi che noi siamo vermi, nati a formar l'angelica farfalla, che vola la giustizia senza schermi? Di che l'animo vostro in alto galla, poi siete quasi antomata in difetto, siccome vermo in cui formazion falla? Despite its theological and poetic power as well as significance, this image has not attracted great attention. Modern commentators have more or less accepted Camporese's argument that it comes from St. Augustine's commentary on the Gospel of John, where the bishop describes the transformation of the soul from worm to angel. Omnes homines de carne nascentes quid sunt nisi vermes, et de vermibus angelus facit. Although close to Dante's tercet, Augustine's quotation does not mention the butterfly, and in fact, it clearly distinguishes the two creatures. the worm and the angel, as extremes of the creation that only miraculously meet through the intervention of grace. On closer inspection, however, Augustine's gloss offers a clue to reconstructing more precisely the motives that led Dante to formulate this unique image. The clue is indeed the worm, a biblical symbol of moral degradation that both Dante and Augustine employ to reflect on human destiny. However, as I'll try to argue tonight, unlike the Bishop of Hippo, Dante approached the biblical image of the worm from the specula of Aristotle's natural science and dedicated his three Purgatorio tercet to the reconciliation between the laws of nature and the grace of resurrection. To articulate this hypothesis, we will not talk of angel, and we will not soar to heaven as one might expect, but we'll have to dwell on what the Bible, medieval science, and Dante said about grimy and amorphous worms. So let's start with Dante. The metaphor of the butterfly that we've just seen is rooted in what the pilgrim experiences on the terrace of the proud. In the gloomy setting of this canto, in fact, the proud are crushed by the humiliating weight of large boulders and are forced to crouch on the ground, just like worms hiding under stones in damp earth. Io cominciai, maestro, quel che io veggio muovere a noi, non mi sembian persone, e non so che, sì nel veder vaneggio. Ed egli a me la grave condizione di lor tormento, a terra li rannicchia, sì che i miei occhi pria nebber tencione, ma guarda fiso là e disviticchia, col viso quel che vien sotto a quei sassi, già scorger poi come ciascun si picchia. Such is the physical metamorphosis of this penitence, that the pilgrim is led to believe that they are like screws. This is the word, this vitikia. Twisted under the great load they carry, the penitents are like screws. This detail is not accidental, but is intended to visually identify the penitents with worms, which in scientific literature were often defined as annulosa. In the 13th century, this term, which was also used by Michael Scotus in his translation of Aristotle's De Animalibus, was often used by natural scientists to describe the flexible structure of small invertebrates that are formed by rings or wrinkles. So technically ringed or wrinkled, the bodies of the proud that the pilgrim encounters are actually not people, persone, but worms hidden under heavy rocks. It is no coincidence, therefore, that the spectacle of this transformation should be immediately followed by the poet's dramatic reflection on the nature of human life, seen as a transformative process that can rise from filth to angelic beauty. In these memorable verses, which describe and reflect on the penitence of the proud, the worm is first of all the embodiment of contemptus, of human's fragility. The worm is a penitential topos, and one which had become greatly popularized by St. Francis, one of the silent presences of the cantos of the proud. To recognize one's worm, one's fragility, and to live humbly was indeed Francis' charism. A charism he also urged others to follow and imitate. We must not be wise and prudent according to the flesh, but instead we must be simple, humble, and pure. And let us hold our bodies in scorn and contempt, because through our own fault we are all wretched and corrupt, disgusting, and worms, as the Lord says through the prophets in Psalm 21:7. I am a worm and not a man, the scorn of men and the outcast of the people. As Francis' citation of Psalm 21:7 shows, the humus in which his call to humility was rooted was deeply biblical. Scarcely mentioned in the New Testament, in fact, the worm has a remarkable presence in the Old Testament, where it appears as a symbol of sin, decay, torment, but also of profound humility. The Davidic verse that's quoted here by Francis was undoubtedly the most important appearance of the biblical worm, and it was unmistakably read in Christological terms. According to medieval exegetes, in this psalm, Christ declares himself to be a worm for two reasons: the humility and humiliation of his incarnation, and his birth from a pure mother, which distinguishes him from sinful human beings. The Lord was not undeservedly called a worm, therefore, because he was mortal, because he was born of flesh without the mixture of human seed, because his ways were silent and lowly, for the Creator compares himself with humbles of creatures, says Cassiodorus. So, advancing from commentary to commentary, this kind of interpretation of Psalm 21 also had profound effects on the exegesis of other passages that contain the word vermis, worm. One of these passages is Isaiah 41:14. Fear not, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel, I am the one who helps you, declares the Lord. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. In light of Psalm 21:7, the commentators of this passage suggested that Jacob was called a worm because his obedience humbled him in order to make him similar. Imitans is the word used by Jerome, similar to the Savior. But the chains of biblical concordances are relentless, and Isaiah 41:14 did not fail to remind the exegetes of Job, the man who declares himself to be the brother of worms. I have said to corruption, thou art my brother, to the worm, thou art my mother and my sister. For the medieval interpreter like Thomas Aquinas, Job, the worm, was not only a sign of humility, but also of human fragility, corruption, and decay. This strong identification between Job as the prototype of the human sinner and the worm as putrefaction was highly problematic because it forced the exegetes to distinguish between the worm man, born and in and destined to putrefaction, and the worm Christ, born without lust in the pure soil of the Virgin's womb. However, this distinction between different types of worms and habitats did not resolve the contradictions inherent in the Christological reading of this biblical symbol. And that's because exegetes claimed that the decay from which worms are born concerned only human beings, and yet Adam, the first sinner, was created by God in his own image. Despite the exegetes' best efforts, therefore, biblical passages in which the worm was actually, presented a problem, a crux. The worm remained a difficult sign to decipher. The complications were compounded by the many biblical passages in which the worm was actually just a tormentor, a punishment that awaited sinners after death. The idea that the worm was created to torment people in the afterlife fitted well with what the scientific literature said about the putrid and rotten habitat in which this tiny parasite swarmed. The association between worms and putrefaction had even led Peter Comester to question whether these insects had been created before the original sin. And to conclude, as a matter of fact, that only after Adam's and Eve's fall, the parasites were made harmful in order to punish, correct, and instruct humans. This punitive role was perhaps the most popular aspect of the worm in the Middle Ages, and as the important studies of Leda and Canova remind us, Dante himself did not fail to make use of this topos in his Inferno, where the great worms, Cerberus and Lucifer, torture the damned for eternity. Indeed, Cerberus and Lucifer illustrate the problem that Dante, like any other exegete, had to face in composing the Terzine of Purgatorio 10, from which we began. How can the same creature, the worm, produce both monsters in hell and angels conforming to Christ? As we have seen, biblical commentators have failed to solve these rebus. Not even their frequent appeal to medieval scientific literature could explain in a coherent and unified way the various appearances of this filthy creature in different contexts of the biblical narrative. But by the mid-13th century, the science of worms had experienced profound changes, which, albeit rarely, affected the way in which some readers of the Bible attempted to unravel the knot of the biblical worm. These changes were brought about by the introduction of Aristotle's De Animalibus and by Albert the Great extensive commentary on it, which was composed around 1250 and 1264. Important stimuli for this tradition also came from the medical knowledge of Arab-Latin origin linked to Avicenna's canon, which was translated around 1175 by Gerard of Cremona. In this growing scientific tradition, worms remained a very hybrid and incredibly inclusive category, one that does not coincide with the modern category of insects. However, despite the taxonomic vagueness, the scientific literature of the second half of the 13th century is characterized by a great effort to distinguish various types of insects, not only on the basis of their morphology, but also and above all according to differences in their generation and evolution. This effort found, as I said, its most systematic realization in Albert the Great work on animals. Here, following Aristotle, Albert distinguished between perfect and imperfect animals on the basis of the conditions of their generation. In his taxonomy, only animals born from fertilization can be said to actually be perfect. In fact, during embryonic morphogenesis, animals that are imperfect to start with, are transformed according to sequences that Aristotle compares to the movement of the automata. These were mechanical machines used for spectacles in classical Greek temples and theaters. The automata contain a potentiality which, set in motion by an external fertilizing agent, the seed or the pneuma, becomes active. In the absence of this external agent, animals that are born spontaneously are necessarily imperfect or incomplete. Thus, theorized, Aristotle's animal world is very hierarchical. Not all animals are equal, and in this world, even insects are not all made equals. Most of them belong to the category of imperfect or incomplete animals, i.e. animals that produce larvae that are born spontaneously in soil and rot. Others, however, are produced by animals of the same appearance and nature as themselves. This last category of insects corresponds to those insects that are born looking like their animals, and therefore like their parents, sorry, and therefore animals that do not undergo major morphological changes except to increase in size. However, there is a third category of insects that do not fall in any of these other groups. These are often produced by mating, so through fertilization, but are not born perfect. To become perfect, they have to undergo a process of complete metamorphosis during their own life. And from larvae, they need to become chrysalis, and thus slowly acquire the perfection lacking in the insect born from eggs. These wasps and butterflies belong to this category. They all go through Genesis 3 times before they can become perfect and similar in every aspect to their parents. As said, thanks in part to Albert the Great's commentary, Aristotle's De Animalibus had a fundamental impact on late medieval scientific literature and on the classification of worms. But the new Aristotelian theories on insects also had, in some cases, repercussions on the interpretation of the biblical worm. Indeed, the possibility of distinguishing between different types and category of worms offered the opportunity to reconsider the biblical image, which, as we said, had been a puzzle for interpreters. The most manifest and complete example, and to my knowledge, the first of these examples that I have been able to find, is offered by Philip the Chancellor Summa on the Psalm, Sermones sive distinctiones sive summa super Psalterium. Philip was a Parisian magister, active between 1165 and 1236. It would appear that on the basis of what seems to be a very early contact with Aristotle, the Animalibus, Philip was able to discuss worms and introduce a fourfold distinction between different types of insects. The Magister considers the possibility of examining Psalm 21:7 on the basis of 4 different typologies of worms: Tinea, Teredo, Intestinum terrae, et Bombyx. According to Philip's moral interpretation, these 4 insects corresponds to 4 virtues of Christ: repentance, meekness, humility, and prudence. What Philip says about worms from a moral point of view, from the typice, from the point of view of moral interpretation, what Philip says is not very different from what his predecessors had written, talking about this little creature. What changes in Philip's analysis, however, is his attempt to resolve the biblical rebus on the basis of a more precise understanding of nature, an understanding which he obviously got through Aristotle, De Animalibus. A clear symptom of Aristotle's influence on Philip the Chancellor is certainly his treatment of the 4th type of worm, the Bombyx, which is a silkworm. First, after describing the morphology of the Bombyx, Philip states that the Bombyx signifies prudence, a virtue which protects humans from carnal temptation. But the Bombyx also signifies Christ, a silkworm who died to give humans the silky dress of resurrection. The wording that Philip uses is actually this, Christ emptied himself like a chrysalis in order to give us the silk of resurrection. But the exegete also notes that the bombyx mutates, and by mutating, it reaches its perfection. So it's the word perfection that is sort of the alarm bell that reveals to us the presence of Aristotle here. So just like Christ did in his transfiguration and resurrection, so the bombyx changes to achieve its perfection. The perfection of the body alluded by Philip is clearly the same that was postulated by Aristotle, who, as we've seen, considered the bombyx to be one of the insects capable of attaining its complete and adult form through a triple metamorphosis. On the basis of this fundamental information, Philip the Chancellor transforms entomological details into signs of Christian perfection. Christ is born a worm, then like a cocoon, he abandons his human form at the hour of his transfiguration, and finally in his third change, he becomes a butterfly on the day of his resurrection. When having abandoned all the imperfection of the body, he takes flight with the wings gifted to his glorified body. It is difficult to say how widespread this interpretation had become by the time Dante wrote the Comedy. There is very little research done on this topics and on the biblical worm in particular, and on the impact of Aristotle's influence on exegesis. However, there is no doubt that the Summa by Philip the Chancellor, written sometime in the first 3 decades of the 13th century, was quite widespread in Europe. And the manuscript tradition suggests that Philip's Summa was used as a tool by preachers, mainly because of its extensive use of distinctiones. These were like word entries in which an exegete explains a specific biblical word and offers several interpretations attached to this word. This collection of keywords were consulted by preachers who used them to incorporate them in their sermons. So it is no coincidence that an appearance of Philip the Chancellor fourfold interpretation of the meaning of ego sum vermis is found in another collection of Distinctione that had a very good circulation in Italy, the Distinctione super salterium of Eudes Châteauroux. Eudes was a cardinal and preacher of the 1226 crusade together with Philip. And it's clear that, Eudes was very impressed by Philip's new, way of understanding the biblical worm, because Eudes almost, verbatim introduced the same description of the bombyx in his work. Again, it is difficult to say if Dante heard a preacher talk about the bombyx in relation to the biblical worm, and it's difficult to know whether he actually had access to any of these manuscripts. But the point is not looking for sources. The point is looking at ways in which the science of Aristotle was stimulating new ways new ways of thinking about biblical words, the literal level of the Bible. And therefore, rather than looking for sources, I'm interested in restoring the cultural genesis of the poet's creative and interpretative approaches to the Bible. From this point of view, the medieval evolution of worm and the topos attached to it is essential to understand how the study of Aristotle allowed Dante to think of worms not just as insects associated to putrefaction, imperfection, fragility, and even torment. But allowed him to think about worms as perfectible insects that could become perfect in every way. If, according to science, this was possible, then the biblical crux could be resolved, and it is precisely this resolution, I argue, that the poet sought in Purgatorio 10. Here, the presence of Aristotle is made manifest above all through the word automata. This word, which is taken directly from the Aristotelian tradition of the De Animalibus, demonstrates, as Lorenzo Minio Paluello argued some decades ago, Dante's willingness and ability to describe the biology of automata, which we have, perhaps expounded on too much. So the use of these words allowed Dante to describe the biology of automata with precision and care in order to distinguish between two different categories of beings, of creatures. There's a class of living beings that by their very nature have a purpose, and this consists in achieving through their development a perfect form. To this class, all men belong, together with some worms. Men and worms, will at some point become angels and butterflies. There is another class of living beings, however, that Aristotle and Dante call automata, or by mistake, automata. This class also includes some worms that, the worms that are imperfect, that do not develop, that do not undergo metamorphosis. And some men, Dante says, are almost like this automata. Clearly, in this Terzine, the appeal to Aristotle reveals the modern the character of Dante's scientific knowledge. But as I have tried to bring to light tonight, these texts do more than signal Dante's scientific credential. In this passage, on the threshold of the purgatorial journey, which is a journey of metamorphosis, the poet was illuminating a biblical word, a signum, of great penitential value in light of natural science, in order to renew it and make it the perfect symbol, not of human rottenness and humiliation, but of the ascending and eschatological metamorphosis granted by nature, and of course, by grace through purgatory in this case. In doing so, Alighieri inserted himself into an authoritative chain of commentaries on the biblical worm, with the ambition of clarifying in an entirely original manner a biblical crux that, as we've said, brought exegetes to discuss the misery of man, the incarnation of Christ, infernal damnation, and resurrection, without finding a convincing symbolic narrative. To achieve this symbolic narrative, Dante merged two traditions, the scientific and the biblical, and managed to explain how this symbol can actually signify both damnation and salvation. As said, Aristotle allowed him to distinguish between perfect and imperfect worms on the basis of their generation. And this distinction was essential to clarify how the worms of hell, Lucifer, Cerberus, as well as all the other sinners on the one end, and the proud of Purgatorio 10, as well as all the others, penitents on the other hand, are all worms, but of a different kind, of a different nature. This reflection on the Aristotelian worm also allows him to explain how penitents develop in the likeness of the Christ worm, from worm to butterfly, from, while imperfect sinners lose the chance to achieve this perfection and become imitators of Lucifer. Lucifer, in particular, is subject to a metamorphosis in reverse. He was created perfect with wings, but in hell, he's converted into a larva with pretty ugly wings for eternity. Like an immature larva, he is imperfect because he is dissimilar to his parent. As Albert the Great has explained, in the universe of nature, which always desires perfection, a worm can achieve perfection through likeness with its makers. Pro tempore perficitur et tunc credit ad parenti sui similitudinem. This similarity, on the other hand, is against nature's telos. Lucifer chose this similarity, and for this reason, he is the most imperfect of creatures. Created as a butterfly after his fall, is just like one of those tormenting worms that Peter Comester considered to have become harmful only after the fall of Adam and Eve. Fallen like their king, infernal sinners are also undeveloped worms who have wasted their chance for metamorphosis and have rejected their parent. In the contra natura world of sin, both sinners and the tormenting worms are blocked automata, prisoners of the regio di similitudinis. On the other hand, those who choose to be in the likeness of God become perfect. Dante's proud are in fact worms destined for the same metamorphosis experienced by the Christ bombyx described by Phillips the Chancellor. Here, finally, bombyx goes forth with 4 wings, taking all of his imperfection. The novelty born of Dante's genius is not to be underestimated. Thanks to Augustine, Dante knew that from being a worm, man can become an angel. But in Purgatorio 10, as no exegete had done before, he applies the Aristotelian theory of the perfectibility of the bombyx, which Philip had tested on Christ. Dante applies it to man. As we said at the start, at the start of this lecture, in Purgatorio 10, in the first terrace of the world in which men's moral and physical metamorphosis can begin, the pilgrim poet observes worms awaiting their final change. But this change will only actually be concluded, will only be finalized at resurrection. It is no coincidence, therefore, that when Dante meets the first soul in Paradiso that has actually become full, pure light, that is, when Dante meets Charles Martel, this, soul appears to him as a chrysalis. La mia letizia mi ti tien celato che mi raggiano intorno e mi nasconde quasi animal di sua seta fasciato. In Paradiso 8, Charles, who's now blessed, is no longer a worm, and not a worm like the penitents in Purgatorio 10, but a chrysalis. He appears to Dante like the cocoon of a silkworm. In this third set, Dante develops the image of the worm and the chrysalis to describe the state of the blessed along the same lines that we have found in Philip the Chancellor. But in Paradiso 8, the bundle of shining silk is also a sign of the pilgrim's imperfection, which only allows him to perceive divinity under a veil. Charles Martel's metamorphosis is barely comprehensible to the human senses. And yet, this metamorphosis is not complete. Charles the chrysalis is a figure of things to come. His metamorphosis into a butterfly will be only completed after the resurrection. Only at that point, like all other human beings in heaven, he will take off his imperfect shape and will be in the likeness of his parent. The perfection of the resurrected had been at the center of Dante's reflection since the time of the Convivio, where, confirming the line of thought that we've seen emerging this evening, it was already rooted in Aristotle's De Animalibus. In the second book of the treatise, in fact, the poet opens a digression on the immortality of humans and discusses this, perfection on the basis of Aristotle, on the basis of the perfection that Aristotle attributed to humans in the De Animalibus. Whether Dante had a full contact with the De Animalibus at this stage of his writing, it seems doubtful. However, it is, what we find in Purgatorio 10 with his reference to Automata suggests that Dante actually then, at least at a later stage, learned quite a lot of Aristotelian science on animals. So let's read the passage. Everyone is certain that human nature is more perfect than all the other natures down here, and no one denies these. And Aristotle affirms it when he says in the 2/10 of the Animals that man is more perfect than all the animals. Therefore, let it be the case that many animals that live are entirely mortal, as well as brute animals, and are without this hope while they live, that is, of another life. If our hope were in vain, our defect would be greater than that of any other animal. So let it be the case that many have already been who have given this life for that life. And thus it would follow that the most perfect animal, that is man, would be most imperfect, which is impossible. And that part, that is reason, which is his greater imperfection, would be the cause of the greater defect to him, which seems quite different. It would also follow that nature would have placed this hope in the human mind against itself, since it is said that many, after the death of the body, have run to live in the other life, and this is also impossible. By exalting the inherent perfection of man on earth, like this long passage would seem to suggest, Dante is actually always reflecting on the immortal destiny of man, and not on the perfection of the individual on earth. So in actual fact, there is no contradiction between this passage and Purgatorio 10. It is very probable that Augustine was one of the sources that Dante had in mind when crafting his very original image of the angelic butterfly. But as I've tried to argue tonight, it was only Aristotle who allowed him to think about this topos and to rethink the religious tradition in ways that others had actually never considered. It was scientific thinking helps Dante to achieve a new and more complex understanding, not just of a topos, but of the litera of the Bible, of the literal meaning of the Bible. It was precisely the desire to adhere to the letter of the Bible, I argue, that led Dante to create an image different from the Augustinian one. In fact, taking the biblical identification between the worm and man to its extreme consequences, Adam's children become butterflies, not simply angels. The butterfly, for Dante, is not a metaphor, but a vox sacra, a sacred word, a new sacred word, a signum which he has created to complete the Bible. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. That was absolutely wonderful. And I think we should give a virtual round of applause for that amazing lecture. And we can hear some applause there as well. That was fascinating. And I'm sure there are many questions. And so if people want to put up their virtual hands there, and while you're formulating these questions, I will ask a very banal one. But I mean, this is utterly convincing, and like I was saying to you before the lecture started, this is something that people pass over quite quickly in Canto 10, because the focus in Canto 10 in the Purgatory is very different. It's the first time we meet the proud, they're brought low. Dante is given the visions in the three examples, and yet you have this thing. And I'm just wondering, as you were saying it, in this notion of imitation as well, that part of the tragedy, therefore, for humanity, for those who are damned, is their untapped potential, the unfulfilling of this potential that they have, and hell speaks of that tragedy of not recognizing the full potential in metamorphosis for each human being.
Mm-hmm. So obviously what they have not achieved this perfection in life. And so they have not completed their metamorphosis, but they have not, but they are actually born, like by nature, as being similar, made to be similar to God, and so what purgatory allows is obviously the metamorphosis. What I think it's really the point of departure, what distinguishes them is their choice to actually allow the fertilization of the spirit, and therefore choosing to be like their parents, their maker. So the fertilization is something that is both obviously very biological, but it's also like spiritual. So Aristotle actually says quite clearly that fertilization happens either through a seed or through a pneuma, and so it's that fertilization of the spirit that makes that allows these worms to continue their evolution, even if they haven't completed it on Earth, whereas the decision to just like shut down the divine fertilization, and choosing to be different from the first parent is what then turns beings like Lucifer, like human beings themselves, that were created to be perfect. That is the kind of starts the evolution, the sort of counter metamorphosis in a way. This is why Dante says quasi automata, because the human beings are not created to be imperfect worms, and to a certain extent, so their damnation, the fact that they are turned into worms in hell, is an even greater tragedy than being born imperfect.
Mm-hmm. And if I just may add on a follow question, and thank you for that clarification. How then is this, and I know it's not necessarily linked directly to what you're saying, but there is a kind of tradition preceding Dante of the imitation of Christ, and you mentioned St. Francis and the embrace of poverty. There is an actual kind of performative aspect to imitation and shedding one's clothes. And you get it, of course, in the Paradiso with San Francesco, when he takes off his shoes and he starts running to embrace Lady Poverty. There is an example of humanity on Earth, living on Earth, beginning the process of the metamorphosis. But the living, embodied person can only go so far. Is that correct?
Well, yes, it's like Francis himself is, this example, yeah, and of course, he was described, as having become similar to the angel of the sixth seal, and having achieved the total metamorphosis through the stigmata and things like that. So, like, obviously, those this perfection is possible on earth by those who are like perfected, but like St. Francis. So St. Francis is the definite example of how humility is the path to perfection. So this is why Dante develops this discourse in this canto and not in any other canto. He could have spoken about the form of the resurrection at any other point, but he chose to specifically the worm, because obviously the path to perfection is marked by humility. So the entire tradition of the biblical worm, which I have tried to summarize, is not wiped away. I mean, this is a penitential symbol, but it's a symbol that is that Dante sees outside of the narrow boundaries of the punitive discourse that is so ingrained in a lot of medieval literature, because Dante always has this view at what comes after, like it's somehow it's mysticism, it's hope. Yeah, that's the word he uses in Convivio, and I don't think people like pay too much attention to this, but Dante is always like craving for this hope of things to come, even even in the Convivio, when he's at the height of his rational thinking. Ultimately, is meditation is on what allows like hope outside of the consolation of philosophy. There is the consolation of eternity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, are there questions out there? I don't see any hands raised. He's being very shy. I think just because you're
It's
utterly convincing.
it's a very, I know, like very technical, like I have dealt with this medieval science of worms for quite a while, and it's it's very technical, but it is it's fascinating to see how to a certain extent Dante is really doing something completely new. I mean, this is what struck me for quite a while, that yes, I found this, Philip, the Chancellor, development of the topos of the worm, and it's quite unique. It's not very well known because probably it's not very widespread in the medieval literature. So Philip is quite unique, but then Dante, probably independently, not on the basis of either Philip or Eudes, Dante develops his own, reading of the biblical worm. So this is what's particularly striking to me, that Dante is an incredible biblical scholar that is able to really stretch the interpretation to take into account the litera.
And a little bit like what we were talking with Lorenzo last week, also through the poem as well, breaking most rules known to poets by introducing materials and mixing materials in such a way that is utterly new. Okay, there's some questions. George, you're first. Do you want to switch on your mic there, George?
Hi, thank you. That was wonderful. Thanks very much. Hi, Dara. Hi, Daria. Hi. I just want to ask, what, obviously with the silkworm, will be quite an obvious interpretation to link to textiles, and the making of fabric and that, which would obviously have quite a meta-poetic kind of carriage. Do you think there's any way that, given from the information that you've sort of researched and all the work you've done, there's a way you can apply it into how Dante might think about poetry? Is there anything that you see? Are we meant to see the souls as insects? Are we meant to think like insects? Are we meant to think like entomologists? How would you apply your work to metapoetics or poetics in general? Thank you.
Right. So yes, there is it's quite, thank you for this. It's quite a difficult question, but I think it's a question that makes a lot of sense and would deserve quite a lot of thinking. But what I have seen so far is that especially that silk was becoming more and more actually an everyday object. It is at this time when Dante is writing that is silk had become a new business, especially in Tuscany. So people were actually growing silkworms of a new kind which they had imported, and it was becoming a very let's say lucrative business, and so there is also like a very material component to all this. Dante is a great observer of nature, and there is no doubt that that silk is making an impact on him, also because simply of the very new use that people are making of it, in his own habitat. But what all the literature I've seen on the garment, so on silk as garment, is that the silk is also a veil, and so like the sindern, So like it's something that covers, and the veil is what we use to introduce the sacred. Okay, so for example, the tabernacle was covered in a veil of silk, and there is some literature which I've not cited tonight, but that explains how the silk veil is necessary because it was given by God to protect the tabernacle from the human eyes. This, I think, if there is a connection to to silk and writing, it is through the veil. So writing through the veil to reveal and at the same time protect the truth that is revealed through sacred revelation. And obviously this is then all connected to the topos of the sacred book and the parchment, but I think for the veil is the silk is specifically related to the idea of veiling, of the veil that protects. I don't know if this answers your
wonderful answer.
But
Thank you.
All right, we have another question here from Serena.
Hi, everyone. Ciao, Paola. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I will follow on textiles with a maybe less interesting question than George's. I was wondering if there's a link, according to you, between the animal di sua seta fasciato, as understood in this metamorphic sense from the worm, and the bianche stole from St. John's. Yes, that was the question.
Yeah, I mean, like, yes, I was surprised to see, for example, that somebody like Philip does not mention St. John, the white robes, but I think it's because it was almost like identical in the sense that the silk garment is all is identical to the robes of St. John. There is a level somehow of in all this exegetical literature, especially this distinction is where things are quite brief, because there is they work almost like encyclopedias, like like dictionaries and things like that. There is a tendency not to explain too much, and so they become quite obscure. But I was surprised not to see this connection. But it's the same. I am sure that when Philip the Chancellor and whoever else thought of the silk garment as the gift that is given by Christ, what they had in mind was in the John's robe. So this is how like biblical chains of concordances work generally. It's just by association.
Thank you very much.
Okay, before we wrap it up this evening, are there any other questions, burning questions that you need answered immediately? Or you might want to ruminate over them during the week, maybe write directly to Paola, because I think she has given us a wonderful talk and we don't want to tire out too much. Before we leave you this evening, I just want to remind you that there will be no lecture next week on account of the fact that it is a bank holiday here in Ireland. So we will be beginning again with the lecture series on Monday, February the 13th. And on that occasion, our speaker will be Andrea Robiglio, who's coming over from Leuven. And the title of his lecture is "If Dante Returned to Jerusalem, would he find himself in Camelot, on the chivalric undertone of Dante's comedy. So we look forward to that. So we're moving from the bianche stole of the Paradiso to the chivalric world. But please, before we go this evening, will you just please join with me in thanking Paola for a quite wonderful lecture and such original research, and presented quite beautifully. Thank you, Paola.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me tonight, Dara, and thank you for being here with me. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
Bye-bye.